My name is Ethan, and this is the story of the most unsettling night of my life. It all began 3 years ago when I met my girlfriend, Clara, during our freshman year at Princeton University. Princeton had been my dream school since I was a kid, and Clara shared that same dream. Neither of us was from New Jersey. In fact, we were both from Texas, which made us stand out in a sea of East Coast students. She was from Dallas, and I grew up just outside Austin. I think that shared background drew us together in a way that felt almost fated. There's something about finding someone from the same part of the world when you're far from home. It creates an instant bond. One of the traditions we built early on was how we split the holidays between our families. Clara's family adores me, and mine can't get enough of her. Since her house is only a 3-hour drive from mine, we decided early on to spend Christmas Eve with my family, who celebrate with a big dinner and gifts that night, and then drive through the early hours of the morning to her place for Christmas Day. It's become our little ritual, something we both cherish. But it's not the holidays themselves that I look forward to the most. It's that quiet, late-night drive. There's something magical about it. The world feels still, like we're the only two people awake. The route we take isn't the most direct. To avoid the highways, we wind through back roads lined with sprawling fields, shadowy forests, and the occasional flicker of light from a distant farmhouse. It's peaceful, almost otherworldly, especially in the dead of winter. We always play music during the drive, usually old-school rock bands like Journey or Fleetwood Mac. It's our thing. Singing along at the top of our lungs, laughing when one of us forgets the lyrics. It's those moments that make me feel like we're invincible. But this past Christmas Eve, everything changed. What started as a perfect night turned into something I still can't fully explain. It was around midnight when we left my parents' house. The snow was falling lightly, dusting the roads with a thin layer of white. The car was warm, the music was loud, and Clara was curled up in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. Everything felt right, until it didn't. The first call came out of nowhere. My phone buzzed loudly, cutting through the music. I glanced down at the screen. Unknown number. I ignored it, assuming it was just another spam call. Clara joked about how even telemarketers must be working overtime on Christmas. We laughed, and I thought nothing of it. But then, a few minutes later, it happened again. Same unknown number. This time I felt a flicker of irritation. Who would be calling me at this hour? I let it go to voicemail, but the unease lingered. When the phone rang a third time, I snapped. I grabbed it from the console, my frustration boiling over. Clara tensed beside me as I answered with a sharp, "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint static. I turned down the music, my heart starting to race. And then a voice, a man's voice, calm and measured, said, "Hello, Ethan." I nearly swerved off the road. My hands tightened on the wheel as my mind scrambled to process what was happening. The voice continued, reciting details about my life, my full name, my address, even the name of my childhood dog. Things no stranger should know. My stomach churned as I tried to keep my voice steady. "Who is this?" I demanded. The man didn't answer directly. Instead he said, "I'm not here for you, Ethan. I'm here for Clara. I'm here for..." The moment her name left his lips, the air in the car turned icy. Clara's eyes widened in fear, and I could see her hands trembling. I pulled over to the side of the road, my own hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "She's sitting right next to you," he said. "Ask her." Before I could respond, Clara reached over and hung up the phone. I stared at her, my mind racing. "Why did you do that?" I shouted, my voice cracking. She didn't answer, just looked at me with tears in her eyes. I tried calling the number back, but it didn't go through. Clara begged me to keep driving, her voice trembling. I did, but the silence between us was deafening. The rest of the drive was a blur. My mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who was that man? How did he know so much about us? And why did Clara hang up so quickly? I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Over the years, there had been little moments, small lies, half-truths, that had made me question her honesty. But this was different. This was terrifying. When we finally arrived at her parents' house, I felt no relief. The questions gnawed at me, keeping me awake long after Clara had fallen asleep. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but deep down, I knew better. No one outside our families knew we'd be on that road that night. No one. It's been a month since that night, and I still don't have answers. Clara insists she's as clueless as I am, but I can't shake the feeling that she's not telling me everything. Every time my phone rings now, my heart stops. I know he's going to call again. I can feel it. And when he does, I'll be ready. But until then, I'm left with this gnawing sense of dread, wondering what secrets Clara might be keeping, and what that man really wants. In my mid-20s, I worked the graveyard shift at a small convenience store called Quick Stop. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills while I juggled online classes. Most nights were uneventful, just me, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the occasional customer. I'd bring my laptop to work, hoping to squeeze in some studying during the long, quiet hours. For the most part, it worked out. The store rarely got busy, and I could easily set my laptop aside whenever someone wandered in. One particularly cold and rainy night, I was deep into an assignment, typing away at my laptop. The weather had kept almost everyone indoors, and I hadn't seen a single customer in nearly 2 hours. The rhythmic patter of rain against the windows was almost soothing, and I was grateful for the solitude. But that peace was shattered when the front door creaked open. A man stepped inside, shaking water from his jacket. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a scruffy beard and short, dark hair. I quickly closed my laptop and set it aside, ready to assist him. He didn't approach the counter, though. Instead, he wandered through the aisles, glancing at the shelves as if he was searching for something specific. After a minute or two, he left without buying anything. I shrugged it off and went back to my work. About half an hour later, I noticed headlights pulling into the parking lot. I glanced up, and my stomach dropped. It was the same car from earlier. The same man stepped out, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. This time, he walked straight to the counter. Before I could even move my laptop, he asked, "Where's your restroom?" I pointed to the small hallway behind him. "It's right over there," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded and headed in that direction. The restroom was a single-occupancy one, not a large multi-stall setup. I found it odd that he'd come back just to use the bathroom. Surely there were closer places he could have gone, unless he'd been lingering nearby the whole time. Minutes ticked by, and he didn't come out. 10 minutes turned into 20, and I started to feel uneasy. I didn't want to be the person who knocked on the door or checked up on him, but something about the situation felt off. Just as I was debating what to do, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. The officer drove slowly, circling the lot before stopping behind the man's car. He got out and inspected the vehicle, shining a flashlight through the windows. My heart began to race. The officer entered the store, his eyes scanning the aisles before landing on me. "Do you know who owns that car outside?" he asked, his tone sharp and urgent. He wasn't just curious, he was worried. I gestured toward the restroom. "He's been in there for a while," I said, my voice trembling slightly. The officer didn't hesitate. He marched over to the restroom door and began banging on it. "Open up!" he shouted. There was no response. After a moment, he turned to me. "Do you have a key to this door?" I fumbled through the drawer under the counter, my hands shaking as I searched for the key. Finally, I found it and handed it to him. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, his gun drawn. The room was empty. I stared in disbelief. "He was in there," I insisted. "I saw him go in. He never came out." The officer stepped inside and looked around. His flashlight beam swept across the ceiling, and he paused. The ceiling was made of removable panels, the kind you could push aside if you needed access to the space above. The officer reached up and pushed one of the panels, revealing a gaping hole. "He's in the ceiling," the officer muttered, more to himself than to me. He called for backup, and within minutes, the store was swarming with police. They found the man hiding in the ceiling, crouched between the beams. He was arrested on the spot. Later, I learned the full story. The man had been on the run after committing a series of violent crimes earlier that night. The police had been searching for him, and they'd tracked his car to the Quick Stop. The officers told me I was lucky. His previous victims had been alone, just like me, and none of them had walked away unharmed. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Had he been hiding in the ceiling to evade capture, or was he waiting for the right moment to strike? I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that I'll never forget the sound of that restroom door creaking open, or the sight of the officer's flashlight illuminating the empty room. The man is behind bars now, serving a life sentence. But even though he's locked up, I still feel a chill every time I remember that rainy night at the Quick Stop. If these stories left you on the edge of your seat, let me know in the comments, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for more gripping tales that'll keep you hooked. I used to live in the heart of the city. The urban grind, the constant hum of life, it was what I thought I wanted. But after a traumatic event I'd rather not delve into, I found myself unable to tolerate even the faintest sounds. Noise became my enemy. My therapist diagnosed me with a rare condition called phonophobia. Imagine the prickling sensation you feel when your foot falls asleep, but instead it's in your chest, a constant gnawing tension, as if my body was bracing for an unseen threat. Every honk, every slammed door felt like a knife to my nerves. I couldn't go on like that. 3 years ago, I stumbled upon a cabin hidden deep in the Cascade Mountains. I won't disclose its exact location, for reasons that will soon become clear, but let's just say it was nestled in a remote part of Washington. It seemed perfect. No neighbors, no traffic, barely any cell service. What sealed the deal was the silence. It was just me and the stillness. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of safety. The cabin was small but charming, exactly as the listing had described. Thick wooden beams, a sturdy stone fireplace, and the faint scent of pine and aged paper greeted me when I stepped inside. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world. The nearest neighbor, an elderly woman named Clara, lived about a 10-minute walk down a narrow, winding trail. I didn't meet her right away. For the first few days, I simply basked in the quiet. Birdsong replaced sirens, and at night, the only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. It was as if the world had paused, and I could finally breathe. I worked remotely, so there was no need to venture beyond the cabin. But about a week after I moved in, there was a knock at the door. No doorbell, just 3 sharp raps that echoed through the stillness. I opened it to find Clara standing there, clutching a basket of homemade preserves. She looked like she'd stepped out of a different era. Long silver hair, piercing green eyes, and a demeanor that was both welcoming and unsettling. She introduced herself and mentioned she lived down the trail, though the dense woods made the distance feel much greater. Clara wasn't rude, but she was intense. She handed me the basket with a firmness that left no room for refusal. Her gaze lingered, as if she were waiting for me to say something profound. When I simply thanked her, she leaned in and said, "Keep your lanterns full, your windows locked, and your wits sharper than your blade." Her words hung in the air like a warning. I nodded, smiled, and closed the door, but I could hear her standing there for nearly a minute before her footsteps finally retreated. The encounter left me uneasy, but I brushed it off. Clara seemed eccentric, not dangerous. I set the basket on the kitchen counter and didn't think much of it. Until that night, a thunderstorm rolled in, which was unusual for the region. The power flickered, so I lit a few candles and curled up with a book. The storm's natural sounds didn't bother me. In fact, I found them soothing. But then, around midnight, there was a loud, frantic banging at the door. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and peered through the window. It was Clara, drenched and wide-eyed. She blurted out that she'd seen someone near my woodpile and thought I should know. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The rain made it impossible to see anything beyond the trees. Clara's eyes darted nervously toward the woods as she repeated her warning. Before I could respond, she turned and disappeared into the storm, leaving me standing there, drenched and confused. Back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. How had Clara seen someone near my woodpile if she lived 10 minutes away? Had she been on my property? And why would she be out in a storm? The questions gnawed at me as I locked the doors and windows, my nerves on edge. Hours later, I woke to the sound of a branch snapping outside my bedroom window. I crept to the window and froze. Clara was standing at the edge of the woods, her back to the cabin. Her hair was wild, her posture tense. As I watched, she began to turn toward the house. I ducked below the window, my heart pounding. When I dared to look again, she was gone. The next morning I decided to confront her. But when I reached her cabin, I was met with an unsettling sight. The place was abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. My mind raced. Who or what had I been talking to? That night, as I lay in bed, the cabin was enveloped in an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden beams settling. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press against the walls. Just as I began to drift into an uneasy sleep, I heard it. A soft, almost hesitant knock at the door. It was so faint that at first I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder this time, sending a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. My heart pounded as I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. I crept to the window, my breath shallow, and peered through the glass. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't Clara. Standing on my porch was a burly man, his silhouette hulking and menacing in the dim moonlight. His face was shadowed, but I could make out a thick, unkempt beard and eyes that glinted with an unsettling intensity. He stood unnervingly still, his gaze fixed on the door as if he could see right through it. My mind raced. Who was he? What did he want? And why was he here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? Panic surged through me as I backed away from the window, my movements slow and deliberate to avoid making a sound. I retreated to the bathroom, the only room with a lock, and closed the door as quietly as I could. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The operator's voice was calm, but I could barely whisper my location over the sound of my own frantic breathing. As I spoke, a loud, splintering crash echoed through the cabin, the sound of the front door being forced open. My stomach dropped. He was inside. I crouched in the corner of the bathroom, clutching my phone like a lifeline, as the man began to ransack the cabin. The sounds were deafening. Furniture being overturned, glass shattering, wood splintering under the force of his blows. Each noise sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle any sound, my mind racing with horrifying possibilities. What if he found me? What if he wasn't alone? The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally the sounds stopped. The cabin fell into an unnatural silence, broken only by the faint hum of the operator's voice on the other end of the line. When the police arrived, it felt like hours had passed, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. They searched the property, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but the man was long gone. The officers were dismissive, almost indifferent, as I pleaded with them to investigate Clara's cabin. "No one's lived there in years," one of them said with a shrug, as if that explained everything. Their lack of urgency infuriated me. Didn't they understand? Something was deeply wrong here, and I felt like I was the only one who could see it. I moved out the next day, my nerves frayed and my mind haunted by the events of that night. The experience has stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind like a shadow I can't shake. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of it. Some people have suggested that Clara was a spirit, a guardian of sorts, trying to protect me from the man who broke into my cabin. Others think she and the man were squatters, working together in some twisted scheme, though I can't understand why she would warn me if she meant me harm. The truth is, I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that silence can be deceiving. In the woods, where the world feels so far away, it's easy to believe you're alone. But sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are all too real, and the line between the living and the dead, or the sane and the unhinged, is far thinner than we'd like to believe. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something far darker than I'll ever fully understand. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, I still hear that soft, hesitant knock at the door, a reminder that the woods hold secrets I may never unravel. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more creepy stories, and stay safe.